when we first spoke, we spoke about the ruling elite, the type that we find walking the halls of Westminster or Brussels or across the Atlantic in Washington or in big business and NGOs, that kind of mindset. And I asked you whether you thought it could be reformed or to become closer to the people, or whether it needed to be replaced. And you unequivocally said, no, there's going to be no come to Jesus moment, it needs to be replaced. And I suppose what's happened since then? Well, we've seen earlier this month, so we're recording towards the end of June here, on the 9th of June, there were the European Parliament elections. And to put it mildly, I think we saw a huge surge in support for populist parties, and not just from boomers either. We had populist sovereigntist parties coming first and second in 10 out of 27 EU member states, including France, Germany, and Italy. And I think in France, 32% of Gen Z voters voted for Marine Le Pen's Rassemblement National. So is this the beginning of the end for what the current ruling elite represents, Frank?
I don't know. I wish it was, but I think there's a long way to go. I think the really exciting development is that a growing number of young people have decided to basically kick up against the status quo as it exists. They kind of become very cynical and distrust the old political establishment. And you can see that from everywhere, from Holland to Sweden to France. You can see it as a real kind of generational estrangement from the old ways. In that respect, I think Britain is a little bit different, where it's still a bit more sort of static in that respect. But overall, there seems to be a kind of recognition that enough is enough. Some kind of change is needed. And what you now have, I think, is a bifurcation of young people, where some young people, particularly from the more privileged sections of society, are more likely to stay with the existing cultural and political establishment than the people that are coming from less privileged, more working class areas of society, who are really feeling the pinch and very often feel that the cultural ideals of society are not the ones they would like to share, but they are ones that they are reacting against.
Resurgence is the wrong word, the surge in interest, I suppose, amongst the ideas and values that are being represented and broadcast, I suppose, like Le Pen's Rassemblement National, like increasingly reform in the UK, even if it's not necessarily in their manifesto, it's some of their sound bites. It's interesting that the youth, I suppose, which we could argue has not exactly received a strong cultural and traditional inheritance, is finding itself being drawn to those parties that are trying to talk to those things. And indeed, I had Connor Tomlinson from the Lotus Eaters and Deprogrammed on here not too long ago, and he spoke very plainly about how he and his generation, particularly those that are leaning to the more conservative values, but in general just rebelling against what the status quo is, feel totally bereft of anything to be rooted to be connected to. They see the impact that it's had on family. They see what it's had on the demographics and the cultural conflict that you see rearing up because of too much ethnic and social diversity in too short a time. And I find that a very interesting development, considering most people would expect that if you've steamrolled over conservative, traditional, or even just more everyday values, that they still somehow find a way of coming through, that there seems to be something within people that yearns for them, even if there's no way of talking about them in the current status quo. Is that something you see?
Yeah, I mean, even when people don't know what it is they're yearning for, there's a sense of being dispossessed of something. And what they're really trying to get at and articulate is that they've been dispossessed of their cultural heritage, that they've been left with very little. There's very little foundation on which they can cultivate their identity. There's very little from the past that they can use that will guide them towards the future. And I think as a result of that, a lot of young people are searching for the kind of meaning that the more technocratic, elitist, cosmopolitan ideals cannot provide. So one of the things that I'm experiencing everywhere in Europe is that the quest for meaning, which is always a part of the human condition, has acquired a much more politicized dynamic in the 21st century. And this quest for meaning is one that's particularly important amongst young people because they are trying to develop some kind of identity. And they realize that the only option there is left is you either opt for identity politics and you become a victim, you see yourself as a member of the LGBTQ, feminist, Black Lives Matter, Hamas kind of coalition, which is not attractive to a lot of people. Or alternatively, you try to reach out and find something within your own tradition, within your own environment, and try to somehow internalize those ideals. And I think that kind of polarized landscape of meaning is what we're seeing, and it's something that's playing to the advantage of conservative and populist parties throughout Europe, because they're the only ones that are providing that kind of countercultural outlook for young people to grab onto.
It's interesting that what we seem to be seeing is a mirror image, I suppose, and this is perhaps unsurprising because anything that comes into being often brings the opposite into being in some way. And what I mean by the mirror image is some of the things we've spoken about there have been about questions of identity. But I would also say that I am increasingly seeing through the thoughtful young writers that lean right, that they have spotted, or at least are building an argument that is predicated on not too dissimilar lines to the decolonization argument, that they believe that through multiculturalism, that through diversity, equity, and inclusion, and through mass immigration, that colonization is indeed taking place, but not in the way that you would typically hear the argument being made. And I find that to be quite fascinating, that that's getting the cut through, that those identity politics, which were played to try to push back against things like national identity, is now coming back to haunt them in some way. And perhaps we might see it continue to develop.
It's early days yet because, whenever you have the unleashing of new forms of identity formations, and new ways of reacting to the world you live in, what you have is a kind of almost like a political cultural experiment where people are trying to desperately look around for ways in which they can develop a sense of belonging. Know what is it you belong to, and what are those ideals that, in a sense, connect you to those that are closest to you. So you have this attempt to do that, and you also become aware of the fact that you've been, to some extent, robbed of your heritage. You've been, dispossessed of so much that is relevant to your community and to your way of life, that you want to claw some of that back. And just what form that will take, what shape that will take, we don't know yet, because to some extent, every generation that does that finds their own original way of synthesizing together these different elements that they are searching towards. But what is very exciting is that finally we have a situation where it's not just a one-way traffic, where basically it's the advocates of the culture war who are initiating everything, are laying down the law, determining what can and cannot be said. But you now have people who are themselves trying to develop their own cultural outlook and a certain consciousness of belonging that is almost the very opposite. It's a kind of there's a moral contrast that is emerging at the moment, which is evolving, and it's yet unclear how that will shape the future. But nevertheless, it is something that is unfolding before our eyes.